All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Seifert, and welcome to Introduction to the Decision-Making Framework. Tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an operations leader and executive with over 20 years experience working in a variety of companies, manufacturing, oil and gas, chemical, renewable energy, and have worked as a plant manager and most recently vice president of operations for a renewable energy company. And earlier this year, I left my operations leadership role to start enabling empowerment with the vision of helping leaders to empower their employees to make better decisions by providing them the tools and the training and resources that they needed to do that. And so really, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why decision making is so important to your team's success, and why, similarly, why empowering your team to make decisions is important. And then finally, we're going to talk about, go over decision-making framework, which is a critical tool that you can use not only to improve your own decision-making, but to empower your teams to make better decisions. So we'll go ahead and get into it here. And throughout today's presentation, we're going to do a few examples of what I call some decision traps. And in order to do that, to participate, you're going to need to be able to text your answers in. So if you look at the top of the screen right here, you'll see that if you send the text C Seifert 705 to 22333, then you should get a response back in your text saying that you're registered for the session. So again, if you just open up your texting app and text to the number 22333, text C Seifert 705. Okay, you can also use this link that's in the upper left-hand corner, but honestly, I find that the texting is much easier. So, all right. So hopefully you've received the message, been able to vote. Looks like at least a few people have. So we'll go ahead and continue. The instructions will be on each slide, but you don't need to text CC for 705 more than once. Once you're in the session, you'll stay in. All right, so we'll go ahead and continue. I like to think about, the results of any team are really a function of the quality of the decisions that team makes and its behaviors, right? And so if a team is making, good decisions about how they allocate their scarce resources, decisions aligned to the vision and values that have a positive return on investment, and they're doing it in a fast and efficient manner, right? They're going to have good results, assuming they also are behaving in a way that they execute those decisions effectively. So the team is fully engaged. They're having discipline to the process, a questioning attitude, and taking accountability and ownership of their decisions. And if they're doing both those things, they'll have better safety results, delighted customers, profit and loss, and frankly, happier employees. So, so decision making is critical to this formula. If you're not making good decisions, you're not going to get good results. And a recent study by McKinsey indicated that only 20% of respondents say that their organizations excel at decision making. Furthermore, what I think is really important, a majority say much of the time they devote to decision making is used ineffectively. So not only do the vast majority of leaders say that our organizations aren't particularly good at decision making, but we're also wasting a lot of time making those not great decisions. So clearly, there's an opportunity to get better here. Similarly, empowering your team to make decisions is really important, right? To making better decisions in the first place. If you empower your team to make decisions, the people closer to the problem, the people with the best information are going to be making the decisions. Decision making is going to be faster and more efficient. Your team members are going to be more engaged and take ownership of the decisions that they're making. And your employee retention and even the work-life balance for your leaders is going to be better. If leaders are having to make all the decisions all the time, they're not going to have a great life balance. And similarly, McKinsey found that organizations whose leaders successfully empower others through coaching are nearly 4 times more likely to make good decisions than those whose leaders don't. And they also outperform their industry peers financially. So there's a competitive advantage to be had by empowering your teams to make good decisions. The challenge, though, is that a lot of times when we say, hey, we really need to empower our teams to make better decisions, The only strategy that we come up with to implement that is to just make a declaration, right? Wave a magic wand and tell people, boom, we want you to start making more decisions. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why. So if you have a team that isn't performing well and is getting bad results, it's pretty natural that the leader is going to have to step in and start making more of the decisions. Now, the analogy I like to use is to compare it to somebody who's drowning in a lake. Somebody's drowning in a lake, that's not the time to teach them how to swim. That's the time to jump in and save them, right? And so a lot of times the leader finds themselves in this position where their teams are just failing, they're making bad decisions, and they have to step in and start making more of those decisions. And typically in the short term, that results in better performance. So, right, we start seeing better performance, just like if you jumped in the lake and saved that individual. But at the same time, employees get discouraged from making decisions, right? They start to become codependent on the leader and start looking to the leader to make all their decisions for them. Similarly, they're not getting experience making decisions, they're not getting coached on decisions. So what decision-making abilities they did have regress even further. And so the remaining decisions they're making are poor, and we get continued bad long-term results. And ultimately, this is what I call the micromanagement doom loop, right? Because it just ever, keeps going on, right? Leader has to step in and make decisions. Pretty soon they find themselves having to step in and make even more decisions. And unfortunately, the way to stop this isn't to just stop, right? Again, right? If I've jumped in the lake and saved the person who's drowning, the answer to stop the cycle isn't just throw them back in the lake, right? We have to teach them how to swim. And unfortunately, this micromanagement doom loop has created a culture of codependence and has eroded their decision-making skills, and we have to restore that. So there need to be specific interventions to close those gaps. Now, on top of this, even without the micromanagement doom loop, sound decision-making is not an innate trait for most people. Most people are ill-equipped to make sound business decisions for two reasons. First, few people receive formal training in decision-making, in particular, making decisions where cost, benefit, or economic analysis is required. I had, as an operations executive, I often had engineers and operations managers or plant managers making recommendations to me about what we should invest in, or explaining a decision. And the bottom line is they hadn't been trained in things like net present value, internal rate of return, marginal analysis, right? That's just not part, unless they took a business course, they haven't been trained in those things. But even without that, all people, our brains are not wired to be good at making decisions, especially where complexity and uncertainty are involved. So we're going to look at a couple examples to kind of explain this point further. So if you look at this picture, what do you see, right? Me right away, I see a woman who's she's angry, right? She's angry about something. Looks like she's getting ready to yell at me. And I don't have to have a very conscious thought process to understand that, right? I recognize it right away. All right, now when we look at this image, what do you see? Well, I think, again, right away, you kind of see, hey, it's a multiplication problem. That's a problem I could probably figure out. But if I actually start to try and figure it out, it's going to require some effort, right? It's going to require some concentration. My heart rate's probably going to go up a little bit. If I'm doing other things, I'm going to have to stop and put focused effort. So the point is that your brain has, two systems for thinking. You make millions of decisions every day, and you can't think deeply and concentrate on everything you think about, otherwise you'd be overwhelmed. So your brain has two systems of thinking to deal with this. The first kind of thinking is, your reaction to the angry woman's face, right? And that's system one. System one makes fast, snap judgments. It does unconscious reasoning. It makes correlations to things. And most importantly, has a very large capacity, and it works automatically. So if you think about when you're driving down the road, you're processing what's in front of you, what's behind you, what's to the side of you, and you're constantly making decisions, not consciously, but you are making decisions about whether you need to speed up, slow down, move over. And that's system one working. But the math problem is more like system two. System two is your slow, deliberate decisions, your conscious reasoning, cause and effect thinking. And this system is not automatic. It has to be turned on. It has to be purposeful, and it has a small capacity. You can't make multiple decisions using system two at the same time. Okay. So just a few more things to kind of illustrate how these two systems work together. So if you look at this image, what do you see, right? I see on the left the letters A, B, C, and on the right, I see the numbers 12, 13, 14. But if you look a little bit closer, what you'll notice is that the symbol in the middle, the B and the 13, are really the same symbol. So I could have just as easily have read this A13C and 12B14, but why didn't I do that? The reason is because system one is really good at filtering out noise and it's good at using context to make ambiguous things not ambiguous, right? So system one makes these snap judgments. It looks and it says, hey, that symbol's got an A and a C to the left of it, it must be a B, right? And as long as system two doesn't disagree, then that's how you interpret it. All right, so we're going to do our first quiz here. Little question. Again, you can use your text for this. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So if you just text your answer to that number. Good. So, a variety of answers there. The correct answer is, in fact, 5 cents. But you look, if you put 10 cents, don't feel bad. The problem is structured that way. And even if you put 5 cents, I suspect that your first answer in your head was 10 cents, right? The way the question reads, it's very, very simple for system one to say, oh, a bat and a ball costs $1.10. The bat costs $1 more. Let me just subtract $1. The answer is 10 cents. And that's how system one answers this question. But then system two steps in and system two says, well, wait a minute. If I add $1, if the bat's $1.10 and the ball's 10 cents, now it's $1.20. That doesn't work. The answer must be 5 cents. But that has to be system two has to engage purposefully to do that, right? And that's kind of how the mind works. All right. One more little demonstration here. So if you look at the three men on the slide here, the question would be which one of them appears to be the largest, right? And I think most people looking at this, myself, I see the man on the right as being larger than the other two, okay? But the correct answer, if you took a ruler to it, you'd find that they're all three the same height, right? So what's going on here? Again, system one, right, is getting rid of ambiguity. System one has a model in its head that lines that are converging indicate distance. So it appears to us that the sidewalk is going away from us, that they're in some kind of a tunnel. And because all three people are the same size, but the third one appears further away, our system one kind of adjusts and makes him appear bigger than he really is. And the really important point here is, even when I tell you that, and now that you know they're all the same size, you still see the third person is bigger, right? So even though system two is being told, hey, the third person's the same size as the first person, you can't overcome system one. System one is very convincing. Okay. So just a couple of things to summarize here on your systems. And a lot of this comes from a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. Highly encourage you to read it if you haven't read it. It's a fantastic book. But some key points here, right? So the measure for success for system one is a coherence of the story it manages to create. So system one just tries to create a nice coherent story as quickly as it can. And one of its simplifying assumptions is that what it sees is all there is, right? It doesn't ask if there's more information or other things that would be useful or helpful. It just takes what information it sees and it makes an answer as fast as it can. The job of system 2 is to check the answers of system 1. And if it thinks it's wrong, then to engage and use your conscious thought in order to think about it. But system 2 is inherently lazy, right? And that makes a lot of sense, because if every time system 1 came up with an answer, system 2 wanted to stop and think long and hard about it, you know, when you're driving in the middle, you'd be stopped in the middle of the road, right? So you know, that's why, as Kahneman refers to our minds are a machine for jumping to conclusions, right? And they're really good, and it's necessary most of the time. And jumping to conclusions is really efficient if the conclusions are likely to be correct, the cost of the occasional mistake are acceptable, and the jump saves much time and effort, right? However, obviously, when it's the situation is unfamiliar and the stakes are high, it can be very risky. So as Kahneman points out, the best that we can do is compromise, learn to recognize situations in which mistakes are likely, and try harder to avoid significant mistakes when the stakes are high. Okay, and so that's really what the purpose of a decision-making framework is. A decision-making framework is just a tool for when we are, you know, dealing with uncertainty and complexity, to go through a disciplined process to help us make a decision and avoid those decision traps that are caused by system 1 and system 2. So on the left of your screen here, you see the 7 steps of the decision-making framework that I use and that I've taught to my teams over the years. And I call this a framework because, rather than a process, because it can be applied to really any decision, right? It can be applied to relatively simpler decisions, like what to do about a machine that broke down, or what to do about, you know, a customer complaint, all the way up to things that are very complex, like whether or not I should build a new plant or buy a business or start a new product line. But again, those are the 7 steps of the framework. In the middle column, you see a little brief description of some of the questions and the activities that you would do during that step. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the decision traps that step in the framework is designed to help you prevent. Okay, that's not a comprehensive list, and you know, but it's a good sampling to get an understanding. So for the rest of the presentation, what we're going to do is I'm going to go through each of the decision-making framework steps, and I'm going to show you, you know, talk about at least one of the decision traps that is relevant to that stage, and then talk about just a few of the tips and some best practices that you can do during that step to avoid those decision traps. Again, can't go into all of them due to the time, but we can talk about that more later. All right, so the first step in our decision-making framework is to define the opportunity, problem, and the objectives. All right, so another question here for you. How is the capital of Kentucky pronounced? Okay. All right, well, hopefully you all got a chance to vote there, although some of you may not have voted because you know that the capital of Kentucky is actually Frankfurt, right? But, you know, again, the problem here is the way that I frame the problem. And I've even done this exercise with an individual who's from the state of Kentucky and told me that he takes great personal pride in his knowledge of the state capitals. And when I asked him this question, he told me he thought it was pronounced Louisville. And I said, well, it's actually Frankfurt. He's like, gosh darn it, I'm from Kentucky. I know that, right? But why did he do that? Why, you know, might you have answered this question and not thought Frankfurt? Well, the answer is because the way the problem was framed. You simply weren't given that possibility to pick from, right? So the point here, this is called the framing trap, right? Again, system 1, all, you know, what I see is all there is. System 1 is not asking, is there more information? You've already given me 2 things to pick from. I'm just going to pick, right? And that's really how system 1 works. And so that's called the framing trap. And the point is that as leaders, it's very important how we frame a problem or an opportunity, because it's really going to define how we, the choices that we come up with, the alternatives we come up with. So in this stage, right, this is the most important part of the process. If we don't frame the problem or opportunity right, then we're not going to end up with the best solution. In this step, we're going to do root cause analysis to determine the root cause of the problem if necessary. We're going to write a statement that defines the opportunity, not the solution. And I'll give you a few examples of that here in just a minute. Another best practice is to test your opportunity statement with different people and try different frames to see how it affects their response. Just to make sure that you haven't framed it in a way that leads to, like Louisville and Louisville. And then finally, we want to describe, in addition to describing what the problem or the opportunity is, we want to define what the size of the prize is. How big is this opportunity? Is this worth spending our time on, right? So a lot of times when I've gone to sought to empower my teams and said, hey, I want you to bring forward ideas, they're bringing forward ideas that save $100 when there's a problem or an opportunity somewhere else in the business that's worth $100,000, right? And so, we need to make sure that we're spending our time on the right things. So it's very important right away to say, how big a problem is this really? And are there other problems that we should be looking at instead? Okay, so this is just an example of what I'd refer to as a bad problem statement, and then a better version of that problem statement. And I'll just use one as an example here. So if you said your problem was, I need a new house, a better way to frame that problem would be to say the ratio of stuff to space in my house is too high, right? So I need a new house leads me to only one or two conclusions, right? I either buy a new house or I don't buy a new house. The ratio of stuff to space in my house is too high. It gives me many more options, right? Maybe I need to buy a new house. Maybe I need to sell some stuff. Maybe I need to find a storage unit for some of my stuff. And then my ratio of stuff to space in my house would be fine, right? So again, the way that you frame the problem, the way you frame the opportunity to your team is very important. All right, so the next step, now that we've framed our problem, we need to develop a range of creative alternatives. Okay, so another exercise for you here. So again, you can just text your answer A or B here. You meet a woman named Joan at a party and find her personable and easy to talk to. Now her name comes up as someone who could be asked to contribute to a charity. Do you think Joan will contribute? Okay. Good. Look, so a few different thoughts there on that. Look, the bottom line is that I'm not aware of any studies or evidence that says that people who are personable and easy to talk to are more or less likely to be generous, right? I don't know that there's any relationship between those two things. But for most of us, right, if we think she's personable and easy to talk to, that's a positive trait. And so now when we get asked about will she be generous? We tend to think she would be, right? Because we already have a positive thought about Joan. If we had been told that, we met Joan and she was standoffish and negative, we might be more inclined to think she wouldn't be generous, right? Even whether there's any relationship between those two or not is irrelevant to our brains, the way they work, right? And this is called the halo effect. The halo effect just means that when you already have a positive impression of something, you're more likely to interpret new information in a positive light, even when maybe that new information has nothing to do with anything. Okay, so as we're developing our range of creative alternatives here, we want to make sure that we brainstorm ways the opportunity could be captured. And we're going to have people write down their ideas before sharing them. This is a great way to avoid a decision trap called the anchoring trap. And so, anytime that we hey, we're having a group discussion about a problem or an opportunity, and we want to solicit ideas. The best practice would be to have people write their ideas down before we start sharing them and discussing them as a group, because the very act of the first person throwing their idea out anchors other people relative to that idea, right? So that's a good practice. Just spend 5 minutes, right? Tell people, write things down, and then let's discuss them. Similarly, don't debate and discuss the ideas until they've all been shared, right? Because again, that might cause somebody to anchor or not share something that they might otherwise. And then similarly, have your leaders and influencers share their ideas last, right? That'll help you avoid the halo effect. So as a leader, if I was soliciting ideas for my team, I always was going to share mine last because I didn't want anybody to, think my idea was a good idea just because I said it first. One of the alternatives we always need to consider is the optimized base case. So that's what's the best we could do without spending money. In other words, we want to make sure that we're I wouldn't say do nothing is an alternative we should consider. We need to make sure that the do nothing but in a smart way is the base case that we're considering against. Now we've got all our alternatives out there, we're going to consider the pros and cons, and we're going to narrow the list down to 3 or 4 most attractive opportunities. Okay, so the next step, now we've taken our big list of opportunities and we've narrowed it down to 3 or 4. Now we need to identify the key drivers of success. So we've got another exercise for you here. The question is, Ronald is either a librarian or a salesman. His personality can best be described as retiring. It is no doubt that he is an introvert. Is Ronald more likely a librarian or a salesman? All right, so look, again, I think it makes a lot of sense to me, at least, right? You hear Ronald is an introvert, and I think we tend to have a stereotype that, hey, people who are introverts would be better librarians. I mean, after all, they have to be quiet and tell people not to talk, versus a salesman who we would typically think is being an extrovert. But what if we consider this? What if we consider how many salesmen there are versus librarians? Right, I would have to assume, I don't know the number, but I would be willing to bet that there's like 1,000 salesmen for every one librarian in the United States. And I would also have to assume that some of those salesmen are introverts. They can't all 100% be extroverts. So even if a small percentage of those salesmen are introverts, there's probably more introverted salesmen than there are librarians in total, right? And so it probably really is more likely that he's a salesman just by that luck, right? So this is called the base rate neglect trap. And the point here is that system 1, again, what you see is all there is. I didn't give you any statistics, and system 1 isn't very good at statistics in the first place. It doesn't like to do math. What it likes to do is associations, and you associate people who are extroverts and salesmen, and largely because a lot of sales people probably are extroverts. It's probably helpful to be a salesman. Not saying you can't be a good salesman if you're an introvert, but so that's how system 1 works. And absent system 2 having information like the base rate of salesmen to librarians, system 2 is happy to let system 1 draw that conclusion. Okay, here's another exercise. Is the letter K more likely to appear as the first letter in a word or as the third letter? All right, good. Well, the correct answer is the third. So I don't know if we've just got a bunch of spelling bee winners out there, but I can tell you how I thought about it when I first heard this question is, let me think of letters that start or words that start with the letter K. That's pretty easy. Keep, kite, kitchen, hit, right? I can name those words right off the bat. Now letters that have K as a third word, or sorry, words that have K as a third letter, that's a little bit more challenging for me, right? Maybe ask, it's more difficult. And the way system one works is system one, again, not very good with probabilities, not good with statistics. What system one says, the easier for me to recall things, the more likely they are to occur, right? And so since it's easier for us typically to remember words that start with the letter K, then have K as the third letter, the typical initial response, and again, unless system two already has information that tells it otherwise, is to assume that it's the answer is A. Okay. And I'm sorry, this is called the availability bias. We're biased towards information that we can recall easier as being more probable. Okay, so in this step, again, we have our alternatives. Now we want to identify the few variables that have the biggest impact on the outcome. Okay, one tool we can use for this is to draw a cause and effect map that helps identify how these variables react together. And that's really forcing system two to engage, right? System two is your cause and effect mode. And so that's a way to force it. And I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. And that we also want to do sensitivity analysis to evaluate the impact of the drivers we've identified. So we've identified a variable is impacting the success of the project. Now we want to ask ourselves, well, what happens if it changes 10%, 20%, 50%, right? How much does that affect the project? And really the reason we're doing this is because of the 80-20 principle, right? Which just says that typically 80% of the outcome is driven by 20% of the variables. So we don't want to spend a bunch of time doing analysis on variables that aren't really going to affect the outcome of the decision. Okay. So this is an example of a cause and effect map that you could use, right? This is generic for a business. I've got my adjusted gross margin. It's a function of sales and cost, right? My sales is a function of price and volume. But making a cause map like this for your business and understanding your variables that affect profit can be very helpful when you're saying, hey, I'm going to change something. Which of these variables can it affect, right? And trying to understand that from a little bit more analytical rather than just that availability bias of what I can easily comes to my mind that it might affect. All right, so now that we've identified the key drivers, we want to manage the risk and upside around each of the alternatives. So this one's not a voting one. I'm just going to read it to you and ask you to kind of think along with me here. So a study of the incidence of kidney cancer in 3,141 counties in the United States reveals a remarkable pattern. The counties in which the incidence of kidney cancer is the lowest are mostly rural, sparsely populated, located in traditionally Republican states in the Midwest, the South, and the West. What do you make of this? Okay, so, when I think about that, well, hey, I guess it kind of makes sense to me because, I would assume that in these rural, sparsely populated areas, there may be people, right? There's a slower pace of life. There's less pollution. They're not in the urban area. Maybe they're, eating a little more healthy because there's farms and stuff closer to food. So yeah, it makes sense they would have lower incidence of kidney cancer. But what if I told you that the counties with the highest incidence of kidney cancer are also mostly rural, sparsely populated, and located in traditionally Republican states in the Midwest, South, and the West? Well, again, if you told me that, I would say, well, maybe it's because in those rural, sparsely populated areas, they don't have as good healthcare, right? And so there's not as many hospitals. They don't have as many government assistance programs for people to get healthcare. And so that's why they have more kidney cancer. Now, both of those narratives can't be true at the same time, right? And this is a fact. Both of these are facts. Both the lowest and the highest incidence rates of kidney cancer are in those areas. But the only phrase in that entire explanation that has any validity is this term sparsely populated, because what we have here is something called the law of small numbers. And that's the incorrect belief that small samples resemble the population of data they're drawn from. Right. The reason both the highest and lowest incident rates of kidney cancer are in sparsely populated areas is because those are small samples. And so there's going to be much more variation in the samples than there's going to be in a large metropolitan area with many, many more people, right? That's going to regress towards the mean. So again, this is just to say, and we do this all the time, right? If you listen to financial news, or regular news, whatever. They're constantly coming up with narratives to explain things that really there's no cause and effect related, right? But that's because our minds really like to hear causes and coherent stories, and it doesn't like doing statistics. So system one is highly adept in one form of thinking. It automatically and effortlessly identifies causal connections between events, sometimes even when the connection is not there. Okay. All right, so we've identified the key drivers. Now we want to understand our risks and our upsides and our downsides, right? So for each key driver, we're going to develop an expected case forecast, an upside and a downside. I'll talk you a little bit more about that in a minute. We want to make sure we use a correct base rate, right? We don't want to do base rate neglect. We don't want to do the Ronald problem. We have to make sure we understand what the right base rates are. We want to get an outside view. So, it's another common decision trap is confirmation bias, right? We tend to look for information to confirm our hypothesis rather than information to disconfirm it. So if a key driver for our success of our decision is going to be our price of our product 2 years from now, then yes, we should get our sales team's opinion, but there's going to be some confirmation bias there, right? So we probably need to maybe check with some industry analysts who maybe have the outside view of what that's going to be. Another tool is to do a pre-mortem, right? And so this is really using the framing problem to our advantage. So what a pre-mortem is we sit and say, all right, let's say we've made this decision. A year from now, we've lost $1 million. What happened, right? And giving that framing the problem like that to the team and asking them to recreate a story that says how we failed and lost $1 million to spur them to identify risks that we might not think of otherwise. And then another tool similar is red teaming, which just means I'm gonna pick a team whose explicit purpose, or an individual whose explicit purpose is to find data that disconfirms what we think is going to happen. And it's really important to document your assumptions through this process. So this is just an example of how we would do that, right? Like this is a really great tool at this stage in the process, and even when you're presenting your decision later, to use to communicate what you thought the key drivers of the project were. In this case, there were 3, and then you can see the assumptions around what would happen in the expected case and the upside and the downside, and then a brief explanation in the right column about the basis for those assumptions. Okay, so this can be very helpful so that later, if something goes really wrong or really right, we can come back and understand what were our assumptions, how did we miss that assumption, so that we can make better assumptions in the future. Okay. And why do we want to talk about the upside and the downside as well as the expected? So I've told all my teams in the past, the only thing I know about your forecast is it's wrong, right? You can't see the future. Whatever you're telling me is going to be the forecast for what's going to happen in the future, it's wrong, right? It's much more helpful to talk about than the range of outcomes, right? So if I think of example 1 and 2 here, if you look, they both have pretty close to the same expected outcome. But in example 1, the upside and the downside is much closer, right? So there's much more. This implies there's much more certainty about what's going to happen in example 1. Example 2, however, has a big tail risk, right? Big downside to it. And so if we were making a decision between 2 choices of how to tackle a problem or an opportunity, and we were only looking at the most likely, which frankly is what I see in most organizations, we wouldn't be able to distinguish very well between alternative 1 and alternative 2. But when we start talking about the range of outcomes, now we can see the risk and the uncertainty better. And even an alternative like 3, which normally we would totally disregard because it has such a lower most likely case, but you see all the upside that comes with it. Now we can have a discussion about, well, is there a way that we can make that upside more likely? And that's actually a good choice as well, right? So very important to talk about ranges and use that tool I showed you earlier to kind of explain those to people. This is a quote that I really like: never walk into a room without knowing how you're going to get out. And that comes from the CIA handbook, right? But I think where it applies to decision making is always know, as you're thinking about your decision, how do we get out of this, right? Like if things go wrong, when things happen that we didn't expect to happen, what's our off ramp? All right, so now we've identified our alternatives. We understand the key drivers for each of those. We understand the risk profile of each of those. Now it's time to do the economic analysis and determine which one of them is the best. Okay, so in this step, we're going to calculate the economic metrics, the internal rate of return, net present value, payback period relative to the next best alternative. So we want to make sure that we're doing appropriate marginal analysis and counting for the marginal costs. Right, we don't want to use the average cost. We need to use the next incremental cost to do that. We want to understand the time value of money, right? So if I have $100 today, a choice between $100 today and $100 a year from now, I'm going to pick $100 today, right? Why would I want to wait a year? But if my choice is $100 today or $1,000 a year from now, that's a different question, right? So clearly, money is not worth the same over time. And that's why we want to do things like IRR and net present value to understand the true value of something. We want to make sure that we ignore sunk costs and account for opportunity costs. And we want to match the intensity of the analysis that we do to the risk and the complexity of the decision, right? So if I have a project that has 100% rate of return and, very little downside, we don't need to do a whole lot of analysis. Let's go, right? Versus I have one that, hey, maybe it's got a 15% rate of return and it could be negative, it could be really good. We need to spend a lot of time doing the analysis on that one. And then finally, provide tools and templates to your team, right? So like I said, a lot of folks have not had formal training in internal rate of return and net present value. They have no idea how to calculate that stuff or how to make a cash flow statement or a balance sheet. So create a tool, and not just a pro forma financial statement, but one that forces people to go through the decision-making framework. So in this tool, again, which I've made and I've used with my teams, you'll see in the bottom table here, the economic value drivers. Those are the key value drivers we've been talking about, right? And so, there we've got each of our key value drivers. We've got what we expect to get, in this case, $50 per unit for another 6,000 units. And then we've got the upside and the downside. And that's all that the engineer or the operations person has to put in. And then the model spits out those different returns, and I can see the return profile of this decision, right? The expected case of 55%, upside of 183%, downside of 12, right? Okay, so now we've whittled it down, right? We should know by now this is the alternative that has the best return profile and the direction that we think we need to go. So it's time to identify what the next steps are. So this is where a decision trap called the planning fallacy is very relevant. Just 3 examples of projects here, but I'm sure that you can, I can tell you that I have been part of very few large projects that were done on time and on budget. And look, it's not because people, aren't good planners per se, but that there's an inherent bias in system one, that if system and our thought process that, we tend to ignore things that we don't know, right? So that leads to the planning fallacy, the tendency of people to make plans and forecasts based on unrealistically close to best case scenarios. And in most cases, plans and forecasts could be improved by consulting statistics of similar cases, but people often ignore them even when they're aware of them. And the one I really like from this example is the Berlin airport, because not only can you see that they went, more than 7 billion euros over budget and 9 years late, they spent 15 years planning. So it wasn't a lack of effort in planning. It was the, inherent biases that occurred. So maybe if they had looked at the statistics of other airports and how long it took to construct them, they might have had a better understanding going into it up front of how long it was actually going to take. All right, so in this step, we're going to develop our plan of action and milestones, and a couple of tips on that. One, to avoid the planning fallacy. One of them is apply segmentation. So break the plan into individual activities. Understand again the upside, downside, expected case for each segment, and then add those together and see the range of outcomes that you get for time. And look, that can be applied not just to big projects. I've done this with simple breakdowns of equipment in a plant, right? In my past, I've become very frustrated because a piece of equipment will go down, and we would ask, well, how long is it going to take to get it back running again? And I'd get an answer like 12 hours, and lo and behold, 30 hours later, the equipment is still not up, right? What I found was when I said to the team, I want you to tell me your best case and your worst case time to repair it. And then I want you to tell me what makes the best case happen and the worst case happen. What we found was that we were almost 100% of the time within the two ranges, and more often than not, we were closer to the best case. And it was because we drove the team to think about, how they forecasted their time that way. Another tool we've already mentioned, reference class forecasting. That's simply looking at other projects, right? So if I'm coming up with a timeline for building a new plant, and I can go find statistics on how long it took to build 10 other plants. And if the average of those 10 was 3 years, and I'm looking at 1 year, I got to do some serious digging there, right, to understand, is that really realistic, or why were the others 3, right? So it's another powerful tool. We need to make sure we determine what capabilities are required. Do we really have the right people to do this? If this is something we've never done before, do we need to go get some outside help? And then again, going back to the CIA quote, we need to understand at what points we should stop and evaluate our assumptions, right? So if we're doing, especially on longer term, if we're doing a longer term project that's going to take a couple years, we should have points along the way where we're stopping and validating, is what we did this decision based on still true? If not, should we continue, or should we find an exit ramp? And then finally, who owns what, and how will we measure success? All right, so the final step then is to show your work. And so one final little demonstration here. A company must choose which of 2 similar products to produce and sell. Its marketers are absolutely certain product A has a 70% chance of yielding a $1 million profit, while product B has an 80% chance of yielding a $1 million profit. The company executives choose product B, but it ends up producing not profits, but a slight loss. And later that year, the company's main competitor markets product A and makes about $1 million in profit. So the question is, did the company executives really make the right or wrong decision, right? And I think a lot of us, right, I think the tendency for most of us would be to say, well, they made the wrong decision, right? They lost money, and the other company made $1 million, so they made the wrong decision. And I hear all the time, right? I'm results focused, right? That if the bad results, it was a bad decision. Let me pose an alternative question to you, though. If you walked into a casino and you laid $500 down on the roulette table on black and you win, did you make a good decision? I think most of us would say, well, clearly not. You keep doing that and you're going to lose all your money and then some, right? That's called luck, right? And so we have to acknowledge here that, even though our estimation was that product B had an 80% chance of yielding $1 million profit and it lost money, well, there was still 20% chance it wasn't going to work. So it doesn't even mean our 80% estimate was wrong. Maybe if we did the same project 4 more times, the other 4 would come out well. But regardless, the point here is you can't judge the quality of a decision purely by the results and the outcome. You have to understand what information did the team have at the time that they made the decision. And so the tendency for people to perceive past events as having been more predictable than they were is called hindsight bias, right? We're all subject to it. We always think that after something has happened, it's easy to look back and think that, it would have been easier to predict that of happening. How many times have you told yourself, I should have known that was going to happen, right? All right, so when we're documenting our decision, we want to make sure that we do that in a way that's not too technical for appropriate audience. Keep it as short as possible to understand the decision, but no shorter. It should be 1 or 2 pages, right? And after reading this document, the person should be able to understand the decision, what you're thinking and why, and they should be in a position to properly challenge the assumptions and the economics. All right. All right, so that covers all 7 of the steps. Just a few kind of closing points. Again, like we talked about in the beginning, sound decision-making is critical for organizational success. Empowering your team to lead to will lead to improved decision-making and results. And adopting a common decision-making framework will lead to better decisions and enable the empowerment of your team. Okay. So look, how can I help in that effort? If this is something, again, I apologize. We had to go through a lot of content, and there's many decision traps that we can explore. Also, try to make it engaging, online here with the app, but it definitely loses something in from when it's done in person. But if this is the kind of stuff that you're like, hey, my team could benefit from this. I'd be happy to talk to you about setting up a presentation for your team in person, online, something like that. Stay tuned to the LinkedIn page, and there will be more, detailed training on individual steps and individual decision traps that I'll be publishing over the coming weeks and months. Similarly, tools and templates, right? So the financial model that I showed you, I'm working on a version of that I will share publicly with people. So again, stay tuned to the LinkedIn page and look for that to come out, and if that's something that is helpful to you. And I'm also, would love to help by coaching, right? So if you have a particular decision that your organization is trying to make and saying, hey, we want to make sure we really make the right decision, and you need some facilitation to do that, or some, coaching on how to think through that, use a decision-making framework. Again, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or via my email. All right. So that's all I have to share for today. I really appreciate everybody taking their time. I know your time is valuable. Hopefully you found this valuable, challenged a few things about the way you think, and maybe gave you a few ideas about how you can make better decisions yourself, and as well empower your team to make better decisions. All right. So thank you.